In this third and last video on the history of American food and cuisine, we'll look more at the 20th century. While there had been some attempts at regulation earlier, during the progressive age of the early 20th century, the federal government began to regulate foods more uniformly, operated through the Department of Agriculture. The early focus was on correct labeling and testing to make sure that foods didn't make consumers sick. A best-selling novel by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle in the early 20th century shocked people about the condition of meat plants, and that was obviously where a lot of disease were in the slaughtering of cattle and pigs. And so you get Congress beginning to regulate these meat packing plants. And that was a dramatic improvement. The Department of Agriculture would go in and make sure they were hygienic. In the early 1900s progressive era, and continuing through the 1930s, the government began to encourage healthy food consumption, first only focusing on growing children. In the early 1900s, a company in Atlanta, Georgia began to produce a soda that they called Coca-Cola, and it had carbonated water and sugar, and it also originally had cocaine. And of course, when the government began to regulating it for health, what they did was they said, well, you can't use cocaine. And so they went looking for another stimulative, and they found caffeine. But of course, Coca-Cola is associated with America, all over America and the world today. A major problem for farmers at the end of the 19th century was the declining price of the food produce they grew, a product of overproduction in the Industrial Revolution. Starting in the Progressive Age, the government tried various strategies to help farmers. Here you can see a price index for consumer and farm goods. The blue on the left represents the average profit farmers are getting, and the red indicates when the annual production was, they ended in the black, in the red, and you can see that as time passed, farmers were often ended in debt. When World War I came, any problem of shortage of food ended, and the U.S. government wanted to ensure that American soldiers and their allies had enough food. And it created the so-called Food Administration to encourage domestic production and also conservation among the American consumers. The Food Administration encouraged like Meatless Mondays, Save the Meat for the Soldiers, Wheatless Wednesdays, and they'd have slogans like Eat Beans by all means. Future President Herbert Hoover was picked to U.S. Food Administration and did such a good job during World War I that his stature rose. You can see on the left the sign, "Food will win the war, don't waste it." In World War I, if soldiers were away from a garrison kitchen, they received food rations. The rations varied over time and by the unit the soldiers served in, but it usually included such items as canned corned beef or stew, some hard bread or hardtack, pre-ground coffee, sweet chocolate, and packets of salt and sugar. There was a separate tobacco ration. Before World War I, prohibition of alcohol had been passed as part of the progressive reforms. After the war, however, in the 1920s, attitudes had changed, and many people wanted to drink, especially those from cultures where beer and wine played prominently. During Prohibition, people began to brew their own alcohol, and an illegal trade flourished. So-called bootleggers transported alcohol. They were called bootleggers because they'd have the alcohol in containers inside their loose-fitting pants. People also created new inventions like flasks that would fit in a coat pocket to hide their alcohol. The progressive era Prohibition ended after the 1920s. It ended in 1933 at the dawn of the Great Depression. During the 1920s, the economy exploded as new electrical appliances became common, dramatically impacting all aspects of life, including food production. On the left here, you can see a new thing called an electric toaster, and the woman on the right is using an electric blender. Of all the electrical appliances that grew in the 1920s, the electric refrigerator was the most important. It had a profound impact on American food production and consumption. For one, the electric refrigerator meant the end of the era of the milkman. Earlier, because milk went bad, a man would come by every morning and put milk out. And now that there's refrigeration, you really don't need that anymore. And so over time, the milkman's going to go away. When food went bad, you had to get your food frequently. And so there were a lot of small local groceries. You could get there that day's food you'd often buy to make, on the way home. But now that you have refrigeration and you have cars, people would go buy their food one time for the entire week and store it. And this led to the end of sort of the local grocer and the beginning of these massive grocery stores we have today. I mentioned Coca-Cola and the soda pop. Well, with electric refrigeration, you begin to see these soda machines beginning all over the United States. Of course, electric refrigeration dramatically expanded ice cream and other frozen desserts. As early as the late 1800s, there had been a so-called ice cream soda, and by the 1920s, soda fountain shops were common and the profession of the soda jerk existed. In response to religious criticism for eating a sinfully rich ice cream soda on Sundays, ice cream merchants left out the carbonated water and invented the ice cream sundae, they called it. The name was eventually changed to Sunday, AE, to remove any connection with the Sabbath. By the 1920s, ice cream cones had exploded in popularity nationally. With the automobile in the 1920s, you see the first fast food emerging. It was no real dining room. You could pull up in a car, order it, and they prepare it fast, and you could take it in your car to go. The first Indian food in the United States, which utilizes an array of spices such as curries and lentils and a variety of vegetables over dishes often based in rice, came to the largest cities such as New York and Chicago in the early 1900s. By the 1920s, increased migration had begun to spread Indian cuisine, but it still remained relatively rare. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, lines for soup and food handouts became a symbol of the era. Because of the tremendous efforts of churches, charities, and after 1933, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, there was little of the starvation that might have occurred otherwise. Included as part of the New Deal was a temporary pilot program for food stamps for people that were near starvation. In the 1930s, the government expanded its earlier regulation of the food supply, and it created the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, in 1930. Of course, the FDA is, the final say on what food is allowed and how the food's allowed in the United States. In World War II, like World War I, Americans were encouraged to produce and conserve more food. Americans were encouraged to grow their own food in so-called victory gardens, an idea that had been popular in Europe in World War I. During World War II, a more elaborate food ration system developed for the in World War I, labeled A, B, C, D, or K rations. A and B rations were served only at bases or established camps as they required cooking. C rations were the most common and could be served hot or cold. The K rations were intended only for short duration, 3 or 4 days, but were used for longer periods and thus at times contributing to malnourishment. The military tried to ensure a caloric consumption of just over 2,800 daily calories for combat troops. During World War II, rationing was also for everyday civilians, and thus as civilians faced shortages. Every American was issued a series of ration books during the war. The ration books contained removable stamps good for certain ration items like sugar or meat or cooking oil and canned goods. A person could not buy a rationed item without also giving the grocer the right ration stamp. After World War II, the federal government began to encourage the entire population, not just children, to eat healthy food, identifying groups of food every person should consume daily. You can see this on the left. As health knowledge advanced, the government constantly revised its recommendations, ultimately with the food pyramid below introduced in the 1990s. The migration northward of Mexican immigrants after World War II helped spread the traditional Mexican diet. As it meshed with more Anglo taste, it became what is known today as Tex-Mex. While sharing a lot of ingredients with traditional Mexican food, Tex-Mex made greater use of cheese, sour cream, and spices, and cumin. Tortillas were made more of flour than corn, and there was greater use of beef. Cheese-smothered nachos, for example, are Tex-Mex. Some Tex-Mex dishes were made without the tortilla, for example, the fajita bowls. After World War II in the 1950s, there was a tremendous baby boom. Just a ton of babies were born. Accordingly, pre-made baby formula became popular. The economy boomed during the 1950s, with the number of cars dramatically growing, adding to America's car culture. In the 1950s, entrepreneur Ray Kroc bought a small hamburger business from the McDonald brothers and standardized it, spreading McDonald's around the country. Other fast food chains soon followed. With the invention of the television, people wanted to eat in front of the television, and of course there had been electric refrigeration since the 1920s common, and so what you end up getting is you end up getting the 1950s frozen TV dinners. Until the 1960s, most Americans prepared the majority of their meals at home, but with post-war prosperity, more Americans were eating out regularly. The number and types of restaurants exploded. Popular were diners, sometimes with curbside service and servers on roller skates. With the spread of the car culture and fast food, the popularity of sodas spread as well, and the variety of sodas grew. In 1960s, for example, the Coca-Cola Company introduced the first new drink, Sprite. By the 1960s, the first diet sodas appeared with Royal Crown Cola's Diet Right, followed by Tab. The first diet sodas were sweetened with saccharin, but their popularity was hurt by the belief that saccharin caused cancer. When aspartame was introduced in 1981, the popularity of diet sodas exploded, sodas such as Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program of government activism launched a war on poverty. Part of that effort was an expanded and now permanent food stamp program. I'd said that in the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, they had a temporary pilot program. Now the food stamp program is going to be permanent and is the beginning of a cornerstone of American welfare programs. By 1966, the government mandated that a list of ingredients must be placed on all products participating in interstate commerce due to consumer demand for accurate production information. Today, as we can see on the right, products must show complete nutrition data. The Great Society revamped American immigration policies, allowing increased immigration from countries previously restricted. This led to a dramatic expansion in the number of Indian migrants and, therefore, Indian cuisine. By the 1970s, Indian restaurants were in many American cities. By the 1960s, you begin to see the proliferation of hoagie, or, quote, Subway sandwich shops, most notably the Subway franchise, founded in the mid-1960s. After the Vietnam War in the mid-1970s, there was a flood of Vietnamese immigration. This led to a new popular cuisine, dishes such as pho. There was also the growth of Asian fusion cuisine. There was the growth of food delivery, most notably pizza. Domino's Pizza began in the 1960s, but its delivery business took off in the 1970s and the 1980s. By the 1970s and 1980s, people of Middle Eastern descent had also left their mark on American cuisine. Greek food had been around previously, but other Mediterranean cuisine also now flourished. Arabs ate a diet based on grains, olive oil, cheese, and vegetables such as zucchini and eggplant. Lamb and beef were the favored meats and were often grilled as shish kebabs. Eggplants were often cooked and mashed with oil to become baba ganoush, while chickpeas underwent the same process with lemon juice to become hummus. Both spreads were served with flatbreads that soon became known as pita in the United States. By the late 20th century and early 21st century, there was a growing obesity epidemic in America. And you can see on the right the spread of obesity from 1990 to 2000 and 2010. Throughout the 20th century, and of course more recently, diet fads have raged throughout America. Some of the most recent include the South Beach diet, the Atkins diet, the Jenny Craig weight loss program, and the Nutrisystem diet, among many others. A modern craze among health-conscious Americans is for organic foods, free of chemicals or preservatives. Sales of organic products in the United States reached over $52 billion in 2018, up over 6% from the previous year. At the same time, people concerned about the poor treatment of animals raised in large corporate farming operations have pushed for open, free grazing of animals, such as pigs and chickens. Here you can see on the left, by the way, the United States is by far the world's largest market for organic products. A concern for climate change has challenged the beef industry as, cattle produce a lot of methane. Also challenging the beef industry today is the rise of better meat substitutes, faux meat such as the Impossible Burger, which tastes much more like real beef. In any event, this concludes the third and last video on the history of American food and cuisine.